Right, we are in. So, hello everyone. We are coming in for this week's next topic video for this second week of June. And for this week, I wanted to touch upon a subject that I thought might pique some people's interest, and it might be something that we've heard about before, and that would be the topic of prohibition. I don't believe I ever specifically covered this on this channel. I believe I've skirted around it, but never directly covered prohibition on its own. So, for those of you who are not aware of what prohibition was, the general overview is it was the period of United States history between 1920 and 1933 where the sale and manufacture and transportation of any alcoholic beverages, with few exceptions, was outlawed. It was illegal to make alcohol. It was illegal to transport it. It was illegal to sell it or any kind of profit off of it. And this, of course, was because of the enactment of the 18th Amendment, which has since been repealed. That's why prohibition is not around anymore. But we are going to be talking about that period today, about the period when alcoholic beverages, on a large part in this country, were not allowed. And it did more harm than it did good. So the origins of prohibition doesn't just come out of nowhere. It isn't just something that pops up in the late 1910s, about 1920 when it finally gets enacted. It's not something that just comes out of the blue. This is a movement that there's a movement behind it, as with anything that has gotten an amendment into the Constitution, and it is the result over many years of continual hounding by a certain group of people. And it really didn't start to see a rise here in the U.S. until about the 1820s and 1830s, when there was a rise of religious revivalism here in the United States, of tying religion into these problems that people in society saw in society, and kind of using religion to justify why these problems were A, horrible problems, and B, why they should be remedied, why they should be gotten rid of. This religious revivalism that occurs in the United States during the 1820s and 1830s leads to increased calls for temperance and also other perfectionist movements like that of the abolition of slavery. Now, giving our history books and knowing how United States history has evolved, I think we know which one got done first. We know that the abolition of slavery and the debate over whether or not slavery would extend or if it would be limited and eventually abolished was a great debate during the around 1850, right after the Mexican-American War. That leads, of course, to the American Civil War, which leads to the abolishment of slavery with the 13th Amendment, and that was its own thing. Now, after slavery has been abolished, other causes are being pursued by these religious revivalists. And one of these big causes that is really getting some attention is temperance, which was basically the thing for prohibiting alcoholic beverages. And this was something that was rapidly going to gain ground in the latter half of the 19th century. Massachusetts would actually be the first state to pass a temperance law on alcohol in 1838, as early as then. It would ban the sale of any spirits in the state in quantities less than 15 gallons. So it says you can still sell spirits, but if you're buying less than 15 gallons worth, it's prohibited. You have to buy at least 15 gallons worth in order to justify the purchase of this alcohol. This was, of course, not very long lasting, and within 2 years, by 1840, it had been repealed. Maine was actually the first state in the nation to actually pass the first prohibition laws, not simply limiting the consumption of alcohol, but absolutely forbidding it in certain ways. And that was passed in 1846, and then these laws were strengthened in 1851. Other states would follow suit before the Civil War in 1861. So before there was a national amendment to prohibit alcoholic beverages, there was already the power of the states taking it into their own hands to enact measures that they saw as necessary for protecting their peoples and their populations from the evils of alcohol, which back then that was a main driving stay of the temperance movement, was that alcohol made men mad. It made them crazy. It made them murderous. It made them dangerous. And in many ways, that is true. It can. It can, if taken very inappropriately, if taken without due consideration of how much you're taking. Alcohol can very much destroy a person's life. There's no question about that. Those who deny that are utter fools. But if you drink it in moderation, I mean, it's not going to lead to that most times. I myself do not drink, thank God. I have no interest in it. But other people do, and that is fine. It's legal. But Maine was the first one to pass a law, and many other states would follow suit. It was up to the individual states at this point whether or not they wanted to do anything regarding the alcohol issue. By the end of the 19th century, you actually have temperance societies springing up, like the Women's Christian Temperance Union, or the also abbreviated as the WCTU. These were very common by the latter half of the 19th century. These temperance societies advocating for something to be done not just on a state level, but on a national level, something that the federal government should enact. And this is also a major part of the temperance movement, is that, mind you, this was the women's Christian temperance movement. It wasn't just tied with religious revivalism. The temperance movement was a mainstay for women. And this was in a time when women could not vote. Women didn't really have a whole lot of rights in the United States at this point. They would soon. In fact, suffragists and temperance movement ended up kind of joining together and allying into a common cause during the 1910s. And it's no coincidence that in 1918, the 18th Amendment gets passed, and then 2 years later, the 19th Amendment gets passed, which gives women the right to vote. That is tied in. But women were going to be major players in this movement to get alcohol prohibited because they were seeing it firsthand in many cases as being destructive to families and marriages. The women were often the wives of alcoholic husbands who would go out, waste all their money on drink, and come home drunk as a skunk, hungover in a fit of rage. They would, of course, sometimes they would beat their wives, sometimes they'd beat their children out of a drunken fit. They would lose money, they would lose their homes. And I'm not saying this is everybody, it's not everybody, but there were many instances of this, and this was a driving factor for why women were so kind of pro-temperance and wanted to get rid of this evil influence on their marriages and on their families. They wanted to get rid of it. In 1906, a new wave of attacks would begin on liquor. They were led by the Anti-Saloon League, which was established in 1893, which were driven by a reaction to urban growth and the rise of evangelical Protestantism. They would see saloons as corrupt and ungodly, that these were somehow the devil's restaurant or the devil's den or something of that manner, somewhere where the devil resided and was corrupting men by coming in there and getting a drink. And one of the most prolific people during this period would be that of Carrie Nation. The temperance societies and the anti-saloon leagues had these individuals who would go out and go into saloons and make a racket, make a fuss. But Carrie Nation is one that really stands out to people. And this is a picture of this fine little darling. She was an old elder lady at this time, about 1906, but this was her common look. She would bring a Bible into the saloon and a hatchet in the other. And she had a temper. She would go in and she would go into the saloons preaching from this Bible of how ungodly this institution is, how ungodly drink is, and then she would proceed to go around, take her hatchet, and hack open the barrels of whiskey or bottles of beer and just destroy any alcoholic containers that she could find when she went into these raids into saloons. She ended up being arrested over 30 times for attacking saloons and bars with the Bible and the hatchet. She was arrested over 30 times for this, but it struck an image into many men's minds. Some men were afraid to go back after seeing a woman come in and preach to them and then take a hatchet and just smash everything. And then they're worried, okay, she's obviously a little crazy here. Is she going to come after me? But the factory owners were also another contributor toward the temperance movement in the early 1900s and 1910s, as they generally supported prohibition as a national idea because they desired it in order to prevent accidents at their workplaces, at their factories, and it would increase worker efficiency in their minds. So they viewed as this is beneficial for everybody, so why don't we go ahead and back this? This would be good for our business. So that leads us to the time of World War I, which is going to be a big game changer. President Woodrow Wilson would institute a wartime prohibition during World War I, which the U.S. would enter in 1917. Mind you, World War I had been going on since 1914, and we got in right toward the very end of it. It ended in 1918. We got in April of 1917, but we didn't actually have troops until the fall of that year because it took a while to get them over there. But nonetheless, we officially entered World War I in 1917, and as part of the war effort, in order to conserve grain for producing food for the troops in Europe, President Wilson signs a wartime prohibition act that tries to conserve that grain that would otherwise be used for alcoholic beverages such as whiskey and or beer, and move that so it can be used for food for the troops in Europe. Congress would end up submitting during the wartime in 1918 a proposed 18th Amendment in 1917, which would ban the manufacture, transportation, and sale of intoxicating liquors, as it put it. It would so it wasn't. That's what this is something that a lot of people get messed up with prohibition is they think, oh, prohibition you couldn't drink alcohol. No, you could drink alcohol. It didn't outlaw the consumption of alcohol. What it outlawed was making it. It outlawed transporting it. You couldn't go to the store and get a quick case of alcohol, get a case of beer, and then drive it home in your vehicle. That was illegal. That's transport. You're transporting alcoholic beverages. You couldn't even go to the store and buy it because that would be the sale. It also prohibited the sale of alcohol, and you couldn't be someone making it at home because that's manufactured. So it did not outlaw consumption, it outlawed the manufacture, sale, and transportation. So there were plenty of people who would actually, since it would be a year between the ratification of the 18th Amendment and its actual taking effect, it would be a year after ratification on the terms that it would take effect. There are plenty of people who stockpiled the year before Prohibition would begin, stockpiled as much alcoholic beverages as they could find and put them in their basement because if they had it in their house on them, I mean, once Prohibition takes effect, the law doesn't have anything to do with that because that's already on them. It's already been transported. It's already been bought before that was illegal. It's already been made, and they're free to drink as they please. So there were many people who would stock up on alcoholic beverages before the amendment would take effect. Congress would give a 7-year limit for ratification for this proposed 18th Amendment. It received the support of 3/4 of the states in just 11 months, so surprisingly quick, considering that this amendment was the only one to have been repealed. And on January 16th, 1919, the 18th Amendment was officially ratified, and it went into effect a year later in 1920. 33 states had already passed prohibition legislation by the time the 18th Amendment was ratified. So already, most states already had legislation in place prohibiting in some way the sale and manufacture and transportation of alcoholic liquors. It was only maybe 25 or it was only a remaining, I'd say a third of states probably left that didn't. In October of 1919, Congress would pass the National Prohibition Act. This would provide guidelines for the enforcement of prohibition, and it would name the so-called Volstead Act after House Representative Andrew Volstead of Minnesota. The Volstead Act was kind of the main prohibition act that this would come out of. The Volstead Act was the National Prohibition Act. This was just the name given to it. Was the after a prominent House Representative Andrew Volstead of Minnesota would be the namesake of this act, and it would set the guidelines for how Congress was going to be allowed, how the federal government would be allowed to enforce this amendment and enforce prohibition. Strangely enough, and this was a fun fact, although it outlawed things like whiskey and beer and stuff like that, the prohibition legislation did not outlaw grape juice, which, mind you, after so many days, it ferments into wine, and it didn't outlaw wine. You could still make wine at home. You couldn't go buy it, but you could, if you had fruit like grapes at home, you could still make wine at home. That was not prohibited by this. And cider. You can make hard cider at home. You could not go buy it, but you could make it at home. And you could not sell it, of course. So if you wanted to make some at home, that was fine. So strangely enough, grape juice, wine, and cider were still legal to be made while at home. You just couldn't go out and buy it, and you couldn't sell it after making it. And of course, you couldn't transport and drive it around. And here we have another little image here. I mentioned how women here are kind of the driving force behind why prohibition gets kind of pushed, and they see it as it impacts them more directly than some other people. And this is a political cartoon from the latter half of the 19th century showing these women going off on a crusade in the name of God and humanity, just destroying all kinds of alcoholic liquors in barrels with their hatchets and everything else, going after and kind of promoting that women are going to be the ones that are going to put an end to the sale of alcoholic liquors in the United States. Of course, men probably at the time thought this was nonsense. Little did they know that was actually going to happen. So then we come to enforcement. Now, the federal and state governments would actually struggle to enforce prohibition throughout the 1920s during its one full decade in effect. The IRS was actually initially given enforcement authority to enforce the Volstead Act that would regulate how the prohibition was supposed to be enforced and regulated, which was kind of a strange thing to give the authority to the tax collecting body. I don't understand why that was made the case. It was later transferred to the Justice Department and the Bureau of Prohibition, which was also related to the Justice Department. The prohibition was enforced very strongly in areas where the population was sympathetic, such as rural areas, surprisingly, were actually quite sympathetic toward having prohibition because they were small towns and they saw it as largely beneficial that people weren't getting drunk and causing a bunch of ruckus and murder and chaos and everything else. So the rural areas actually were easier to enforce prohibition in. Surprisingly, they were more willing to put down the drink, put down the bottle. Unfortunately, this was not the case in the urban cities where you have many people crowded within a very small area, and it's going to be a lot more difficult to also maintain any underground operations that are going to be running during that period. There would actually be a decline in arrests for drunkenness, not surprisingly, by about 30% in by a 30% drop in alcohol consumption, and those who would wish to keep drinking would find ways to continue nonetheless. So there was a 30% drop in alcohol consumption in the United States after Prohibition is enacted, but there are still plenty of people who are drinking like fiends, even if they're doing it illegally. And that is this brings us to one of the main problems of Prohibition was the crime rate jacked up tremendously because of this. It solved one problem but led to another. Because where there is illegal stuff to be sold that people want, there are people willing to sell it and make money off it. The same kind of thing I kind of use with the drug dealers here in the United States. Everyone, and this is just my opinion, everyone around in politics and everything else always claims, well, we gotta go after these Mexican cartels and everything else down in Mexico who are selling these drugs in the United States. Okay, that's not a bad idea. But how stupid are you people? Because they're not just going to quit. Because why do you think they sell them here? Just to get us high on stuff? No, they sell them here because there are people here dumb enough willing to buy them. As long as there is a market for them, as long as there are people willing to buy it, they're going to try to get their drugs in here. You want to solve the problem? Get your own people off the drugs, and then they won't send them in here because there won't be no one to sell them to. There won't be no money to be had. That's why they're doing this. There's money. There are dumb people willing to buy that stuff and willing to do it and willing to pay the money to get it. As long as that is there, they're not just going to quit. They always want to blame someone other than their own people. They never want to admit the problem sometimes is at home. So that leads to us to organized crime during Prohibition, which is going to be the big rallying point for a big major reason as to why Prohibition ends up kind of getting repealed is because of the spike in organized crime that comes with it. Despite Prohibition basically making the manufacture, sale, and transportation of liquor illegal during this time, it was still going on illegally, and this led to a common practice of what we now call bootlegging. And bootlegging was the process of basically making alcohol at home, illegally, of course, because you're not supposed to be manufacturing it, and then you're going ahead and you're selling that and transporting it to sell it to, some of them would sell it to these underground bars, or what we would call speakeasies, where they would kind of, bars, nightclubs, stores, private or clubs, or whatever might else, that are secretly buying beer and all these whiskey and other types of alcohol that are outlawed, and then trying to claim to the authorities, well, we already had this on hand since before the Prohibition Amendment went into effect, so you can't do anything. The cops weren't dumb. They knew what was going on. They knew that, no, you didn't have this last time we checked. So guess what? That means someone is selling it to you, and that means someone's making it, and you're buying it, which makes you an accomplice to the crime. So bootlegging would be a very big thing during this time period. People that maybe didn't even really have any interest in alcohol themselves, but they wanted to make some money. And there was plenty of money to be had if you were willing to make alcohol and then sell it to people that were really in desire to get their hands on it. There was much money to be made if you were willing to take the risk and actually get arrested, of course. Alcohol smuggling would actually across state lines, and informal liquor production at home would also occur. This leads us to the two very most common types of at-home liquor. Probably the most famous type would be that of moonshine, and then you have bathtub gin, or gin, whatever you want to call it. Bathtub gin, I think, is what I call it. But moonshine and bathtub gin. And mind you, these are not, in many cases, safe alcohol. Some of these are almost pure alcohol in their content because they were made at home by inexperienced people who think they can be a master brewer at home. And there were plenty of these batches of at home alcohol that were not exactly healthy. And in many cases, some of them were actually poisoned and ended up killing people because they drank cheaply produced and unsafe alcoholic liquor. And this was a major problem. Prohibition would see a rise in criminal activity, which would be associated with bootlegging. Al Capone, of course, in Chicago, is perhaps the most infamous of all these men. He would earn over $60 million annually from bootlegging operations in his gangster organization in Chicago. Gang violence would also rise across the country as the rival gangs who were producing and selling this illegal bootleg liquor, as we would call it, to speakeasies and other bars and nightclubs and whatever else. All these gangs are selling it. They each want to try to make the most profit, and they're going to get into competition with each other because now some of them are selling to the same place and they want to be the sole person selling it to them. And that's going to lead to gang wars and violence. And of course, we have the infamous St. Valentine's Day Massacre in Chicago by Al Capone's men back in 1929, of which they had lined several men from rival gangs up against a brick wall and then just took Tommy guns out and blew them away. So there's not really the drop. The idea of prohibition was that by getting rid of alcohol, society would be better eventually. It wouldn't be initial because there would still be some alcohol at home. But the idea was that as the years went on, society would get better with the lack of alcohol in the public system, in the public mind. Unfortunately, that was not the case. It never truly went away. It led to organized crime on an unbelievable scale compared to what had come before, and it really didn't make anything better. It made things much more unsafe because now there were people getting in gang wars over who was going to be selling this illegal bootleg liquor to different places that wanted it. There was also the compromise of people buying cheap bootleg liquor that wasn't safe and then ended up drinking it and ended up killing themselves with it because it was made under unsafe methods and ended up killing them because of the health effects. Here we have a couple pictures I'm going to show here. This is kind of an odd one I found. During Prohibition, you could get alcohol actually, sometimes alcohol was prescribed by a doctor as some kind of a medical cure. They still believed in this back then, like giving whiskey to help with some kind of a medical thing. They still believed in that. And if you needed a prescription for some kind of an alcoholic liquor as part of a medicinal prescription, so medicinal alcohol, that was still allowed, but you had to have one of these. This was a prescription notice from a doctor for some kind of an medicinal alcohol. So if you had to have a prescription for medicinal alcohol, you had to have one of these that showed that you had that prescription sent by a doctor, and that it was officially known by the U.S. government that you had that prescription. Of course, do not refill or transfer under penalty. So every time you needed a refill, you had to have a new one of these. It wasn't something that you could just go, like, oh, I need another bottle, I'm out. No, there was no free, like, it wasn't like modern days, but sometimes you can go back 2 or 3 times before you actually have to get a new prescription. Because sometimes a doctor will just put refills on those prescriptions. Not the case here. Here we have a picture of them, I don't know which city this is in, but this is probably after, I'm going to say 1920, once Prohibition went into effect, once Prohibition is finally in place, and they're dumping barrels of liquor, alcoholic liquor, I don't know if it's whiskey or whatever it might be, but they're dumping it into sewer drains. And they did do this. They would hack open barrels, they would take them out, pop the lids off, and dump them down the drains so that bars and other places would not have them to sell. And this happened in cities and towns nationwide in 1920 once Prohibition actually went into effect. You were not allowed to have it. It was that clear. Here we have another picture. This is a wrecked automobile and a police officer standing next to it. And standing right next to him and the automobile in between is a bunch of cases of moonshine. So this was a bootlegger's car that he ended up getting caught bootlegging. Of course, we don't see where the bootlegger is, but I'm going to guess he got involved in a chase and he ended up crashing the car, or maybe he was just a little drunk and got a little tipsy. And as we can see, he got caught. His car smashed in, and the police officer now has all this confiscated illegal moonshine that he was trying to haul. And there were some people that went into bootlegging not just for a cheap profit, but also the fact that they were poor and they thought they could. Their families weren't very well off, and since there was a high demand for illegal liquor, if they knew how to make it at home, they would make it at home and then try their hand at being a bootlegger simply because it would allow them to get food on the table for their family. There were people that did that, and not because they were ill-designing people, but because it was a quick way to get money to help support your family if you were poor. And if you had the right knowledge and know-how of how to make some kind of liquor at home, it was something you could do. I believe I actually had some family members in my family, ancestors of mine, they were bootleggers because of that reason, not because they were bad people, but because they were trying to support their family. And at the time, it was illegal. Eventually, once Prohibition got repealed, that went away. But, I mean, it did happen. And here is a very interesting advertisement. So this is from late 1919, but this is an advertisement from the Budweiser Brewing Company, or Anheuser-Busch, who makes Budweiser beer. And this is from about late 1919, just before Prohibition goes effect in January 1920, where they're advertising their reformulation for their beer product. Now, Anheuser-Busch, Budweiser was around, of course. This is obviously their advertisement. But when Prohibition went into effect, it hit them hard because they're a brewing company. How are we going to operate? Well, Anheuser-Busch decided to also go into the ice cream business, very cool, very oddly, but they also reformulated their beer and made non-alcoholic beers for people in order to stay in business. It was still not as popular as an alcoholic beer, but it at least kept the company afloat during Prohibition. But they had to do that, or else they were not going to be allowed to be kept in business. And there were quite a few. And that would lead to another problem that we're going to see here in just a second of why Prohibition ends up getting repealed, other than just the crime rate jumping up. Since bottling liquor was high cost, working class and poor Americans would have little access. The cost for law enforcement, jails, and prisons would increase with the jump rate in crime during Prohibition, and support for Prohibition would be waning by the late 1920s. At first, the American people thought, oh, this is a splendid idea. This is going to work out well. As it went on, people started realizing this ain't really working out at all. And then some of them realized, yeah, I think I can go with alcohol. A couple years down the road, darn, I could really use a beer right now. Prohibition would also cause several other consequences. You would have cash-strapped restaurants who would end up closing since they couldn't make a profit from liquor sales in order to boost their already down sales. And you also had thousands dying every year from that cheap, toxin-laden moonshines that were being made. And states would actually be losing revenue because they had been making quite a killing on the revenue from the sale of liquor, of alcoholic liquor, before Prohibition, and they had used the tax revenue from those liquor sales to help fund roads and schools and public works. And now the states are finding out without the sale of alcohol and without that tax revenue from those alcoholic beverage sales, we don't nearly have as much funding as we used to support these public projects. So there's a loss of money. And then, of course, came the Great Depression in 1929, and the country is in the midst of an economic downturn of the likes it has never seen before or since. I mean, we've had the Great Recession in about '08, but that was still not as bad as the Great Depression back in the 30s, roughly 90 years ago. So, with the country in the midst of the Great Depression in 1932, legalizing liquor to create jobs and revenue, which would help the American economy get back on its feet, had a very big appeal. And this became a prevalent issue in the 1932 presidential election between Republican incumbent Herbert Hoover and Democratic nominee Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Democratic candidate Roosevelt would, of course, absolutely endorse the repealing prohibition as a wide part of his election platform, and he ended up winning the 1932 presidential election, of course. So when Roosevelt got into office, it wasn't long before there was an effort to get an amendment through that would repeal prohibition and repeal the 18th Amendment, and that would come about just a month after, not a month after, about a month before Roosevelt would actually take office. He would take office in March of 1933, and in February of that year, Congress had already adopted a resolution proposing a 21st Amendment to repeal the 18th Amendment and repeal Prohibition overall. It would be submitted to the states and ratified by December of that year, the quickest ratification ever done for a single amendment in the U.S. Constitution. And Utah would actually be the state that would provide the final key ratification. It was the final state needed to ratify in order to get that two-thirds majority. Roosevelt, reportedly, upon taking office and having that amendment now in effect, reportedly had a dirty martini to celebrate as soon as he took office, because that was supposedly his favorite alcoholic beverage. And of course, there were other people around the country that would celebrate the repeal of Prohibition and the return of legal alcohol to their places. Individual states would still be allowed to prohibit alcohol. This is something that a lot of people also don't understand. When the 21st Amendment gets passed, it repeals the 18th Amendment, but it still allows the issue of prohibition to be an issue for the states. Individual states, if they so wish, may keep prohibition laws in effect and may pass new ones if they ever want to, or they can repeal them altogether. So now, with the 21st Amendment, the idea of prohibition and banning of alcoholic liquors, that is very much now a state issue. States are now allowed to choose whether or not they want to do that, and even on the local levels, they can do that, like counties. It's no longer a federal issue. And this is something that is kind of strange because even today, there are still some dry counties, dry meaning that prohibition laws are still in effect in these counties in certain states where the sale, manufacture, and transportation of alcohol is pretty much prohibited with a possible few exceptions. And there's a couple of weird examples of this here. But after 1933, some individual states would still prohibit alcohol, but most of them had gotten away with the general ban and done with it by 1966. So by the late 60s, the last remnants of prohibition are pretty much gone, except for a few stragglers. And those stragglers actually exist today. And this was something that I found very odd was as of this year, as of 2024, out of the 75 counties of the state of Arkansas that comprise the state of Arkansas, 34 of those 75 counties, which is 32.3% of the Arkansas's population, are dry counties. To this day, you cannot sell it, you cannot manufacture it, and you cannot transport it within those counties. Or at least, I don't know if it's to that degree, but it's at least the sale of it is definitely banned in those counties, that you cannot sell it in those counties. I don't know if the transportation and the manufacturer are wrong, because some of these counties do have distilleries in them, as we're going to see a very big example here in a second. But the sale of it is at least banned in these counties. So it's kind of weird that 32.3% of the population of the state of Arkansas is still dry. That's even in 2024. That is the most of any state today. And this is the big shocker to, I think, a lot of people, is that Lynchburg, Tennessee, which is the town where the famous Jack Daniels distillery is that makes Jack Daniels Tennessee whiskey. Lynchburg is the home of Jack Daniels' main distillery, and of course, they make the Jack Daniels whiskey brand there. But the county that Lynchburg, Tennessee is in, which is Moore County, Tennessee, is a dry county and has been since 1910. So, although they have this major Jack Daniels distillery in their county, they cannot, they're legally, I think there could be a couple exceptions of how they might get around that rule. I don't know if there's many, but they are legally not allowed to sell it there in their own county where they make it. But you can sell and have taste testing of whiskey and samplings of it at the distillery itself. You just can't do it anywhere else in the county. So there are definitely a couple exceptions to that rule, since they have possibly the biggest whiskey brand in the United States and one of the biggest whiskey brands in the world is in Lynchburg, Tennessee. So I'm sure they've made a couple of legal exceptions or special status rules. But it's kind of weird that Lynchburg, Tennessee, which is home to Jack Daniel's whiskey, that the county it's in is dry. That they supposedly don't allow the sale of alcohol there. So it's definitely kind of weird. It's definitely an odd occurrence. So I think, do I have one more here or not? Yes, I do. This right here is just an image of people. Once Prohibition was repealed with the 21st Amendment in 1933, everyone was just celebrating all over. As we can see, these happy men in a bar just absolutely gorging themselves on now legal booze. And this guy right here is apparently wanting to go after a whole barrel. But I think that concludes it for today's video and for this week's video. Not the longest, but just a topic that I did want to touch upon that I think had kind of been skipped over in the past. So if anyone has any comments, any questions, feel free to put them in the comment section below. As for next week, for next week's video, we are going to do this month's President's video, because the week after next week, the week of Father's Day, I am not going to be doing a video because I will be on vacation in the state of Tennessee. So I will not be doing a video that week. And once I come back, I mean, we'll have one more video for June. So we're just going to go ahead, and next week we'll do our President's video for this month, and we'll have a week break after that. So that concludes for this week's. So, and hopefully everyone stays safe, everything goes well, and we'll see you all back here next week for the next video.